Anyway, welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. This is an episode, I guess now it's an episode of Ask a Left Nietzschean, but we have in the studio today, we have Adam, Will, returning guest, Devin Garay, and myself, Craig, and we are diving into the enigmatic philosophy of Heraclitus, both in his own right and in relation to Nietzsche's work. Our special guest for this episode is Keegan Kjeldsen, a dynamic figure in the world of philosophy. Keegan, also known as Untimely Reflections and Essential Salts, is the host of the Nietzsche Podcast, where he explores the depths of Nietzschean thought. Besides his philosophical endeavors, Keegan is also a doom metal guitarist for projects whom you may know, that you may already know, such as Slumbering Sun and Destroyer of Light. Keegan has also recently authored The Ritual Madness of Rock and Roll, a book that offers both an honest look at the life of a touring musician and an extended discussion on the origins and functions of art and human life. The book also explores the philosophical arguments for art's meaning, from Socrates to Nietzsche and Tolstoy to Barth, inspired by Keegan's experiences touring in Europe under challenging conditions. In this episode, we will explore the nature of the cosmos according to Heraclitus, his views on the soul, and perhaps even his critique of democratic rule. We hope that Keegan's insights, along with the others here today, will illuminate the intricate connections between Heraclitus fragments and Nietzsche's writings. Welcome, Keegan, and thank you for joining us on the Friday live stream.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
I have been listening to your podcast now, maybe for about 2 to 3 months off and on. You're in the rotation, and I'll just plug it right from the top. This is a fascinating, in-depth, and it's also a podcast with a kind of, if you like my creamy baritone sound, you're going to love Keegan's voice. He's going to take you on a journey for an hour, and it's definitely well worth your time looking into it, and we'll certainly link his podcast in the show notes. But Keegan, why don't you, in your own words, just tell us a little bit about yourself, the podcast, and how you came to make the Nietzsche podcast in particular?
Yeah, so I dropped out of school. I was studying philosophy, and I dropped out to start a band because the way I always put it to people is that I sort of realized the options available to me if I got a philosophy degree were to go into academia and spend my entire life doing that, which I kind of hated. I'm not really well adapted to academia. Or, I could just go start waiting tables right now. I don't need to actually finish the degree. And so with that in my head, I had a band at the time, and it wasn't the band that I ended up going on tour with. I didn't actually do anything with that band. But 2 or 3 bands later, when I was in my 20s and willing to make financially stupid decisions and live for the now, live dangerously, build my temples on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, as it were, go on tour with this doom metal band and try and, do the old school rock and roll thing, which really inadvisable. I don't advise anyone to do what I did, unless you want to have some of the best, most fulfilling experiences of your life. But then, you become really accustomed to failure and disappointment and things of that nature. But anyway, while I was doing that, I had a lot of time to become familiar with philosophy as an autodidact, because a lot of the time, you're driving 7-8 hours a day, and the only thing you could really do is read. So I did a lot of reading, and I had a couple of other members in the band over the years who were also into philosophy as well. And so, like Jeff, he was our second bass player. He'd bring like 3 books and I'd bring 3 books, and then we would trade by the end of the tour, because after 6 weeks, we'd already read everything that we'd brought. And so he introduced me to things that I would have never thought to read, like Eric Fromm and Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and things that I just never thought of. And so anyway, flash forward to 2020 during the pandemic years. It was around 2021, and things kind of hadn't come back yet. Things hadn't opened up, and my band had just been, sort of on. We'd been working and writing and recording, but we hadn't been playing live, and obviously hadn't been able to tour. And writing, philosophy, reading, that's always been sort of my second love aside from music. And that lull, the pandemic basically is responsible for the Nietzsche podcast. I'm very thankful to the pandemic for that, for allowing me the free time to do something crazy like start a podcast. And it initially started as me trying to write and publish articles, and I had the realization that a lot of the best medium now, I think, for communicating a lot of these ideas is probably the audio format, because people have found time and they can listen while they're at work or doing other things. Whereas getting somebody to sit down and really read an in-depth philosophical piece of writing is rather difficult. And I also, another thing I should say, because you mentioned the book, while the first thing I did while the pandemic was happening was write down a memoir of everything I had done and experienced for the past like 8 years up to that point as a touring musician. And that's unpublishable. It's like 500,000 words or something of just, a first draft that I'm glad I wrote it so that those memories are sort of there. But that was where I pulled the content from the book that I published, because the last part was the tour we had just done in Europe. And I had the thought at the time that the world of live music might not really come back. The example I've often used is just that, it's hard enough to get people to pay $5 or $10 to come see your show before the pandemic happened. And I was wondering if this would be a social institution that would just sort of go the way of the buffalo in this new world. Thankfully, I was wrong about that mostly. But I had the thought that, it might be a new era, and it might not be economically feasible to go get in a van with 4 other guys and just somehow book a tour where you're playing at all these small clubs. There might not be, the economic stability for that or whatever. And, if that actually is still an open question, we'll see in the coming years what happens. But in any case, I ended up writing this book based on that last part of that manuscript I wrote. And I included a lot of my philosophy on art in it. And I wanted to get it published, and I explored some publishers. I sent it to Zero Books and a couple people, and they all sort of had the same reaction that well, no one knows who you are, so who wants to read your tour memoir? And when I was doing the podcast, when I first started it, I had the thought, I was like, if I build a podcast audience, I might be able to get my book published. And that's actually what happened. So over in a way, the book was sort of like the reason for the podcast. Now it has a life of its own, and I really love doing it. But it was, I don't know. I guess I've had a couple crazy ideas in the course of my life, like starting a band and trying to make a living that way, and then starting a podcast and trying to make a living that way. And that one actually has panned out. So that's sort of where I am. That's what's the story of my life up to this point, I guess.
And that's why I mentioned introduction to you that we have very similar paths. I spent 10 plus years in bands doing a progressive metal band and playing with some, more well-known acts. Then the pandemic comes along, and I had been a teacher at that time, but like you, and I was still doing live music. I was doing basically, cover bands for casinos in Vegas, but kind of like I played open for Snoop Dogg and stuff like that. And then once the pandemic came, it was uncertain as to whether any of that stuff was going to continue. And that's why we created Acid Horizon. We didn't have a manuscript, but like you, maybe the sort of inverse, actually Repeater/Zero Books came to us and asked us, hey, do you have a manuscript? And so in that sense, we do have parallel paths. But it's great to have you on the show. Like I said, I love your podcast. Let's talk a little bit about Heraclitus. We also have Devin here with us, who will have chime in a bit after Keegan's introduction to Heraclitus. But first of all, let's just talk about Heraclitus, the man, the philosophy, what we know about him. And if you had to give somebody a sort of 10-minute explanation trapped in an elevator somewhere in Austin, what would you say with respect to the question, who was Heraclitus and why were his ideas important?
So Heraclitus is one of those figures that we normally call the pre-Socratics, but that Nietzsche calls the pre-Platonics. And what that means is he's doing philosophy before there is any sort of really common cultural understanding of what philosophy is, or any social or academic institutions of philosophy. The way Nietzsche describes it is that each one of them had to discover what philosophy was for himself, or invent his own way of philosophizing. And they all do it according to basically their own personality, the type of person that they are. And Heraclitus, he is a prideful man. He's a solitary man. He comes from a city called Ephesus which is on the Anatolian Peninsula, so that's modern day Turkey. They're a Greek city-state, but they live very close to the Persians. And so they have to politically be somewhat cautious in their dealings with the Persians. And there's this very formative incident with Heraclitus as a young man or young adult, where he has a friend named Hermodorus, who's sort of a leading citizen in the democracy of Ephesus. And he's part of a faction that always advocates caution when dealing with the Persians because they're your much larger neighbor. They're this aggressive military power. We should try and maintain friendly relations with them to whatever degree possible. And he basically gets called like a Persia supporter in the democratic politics of that time. The rival factions sort of tar and feather him with that accusation. And the Greeks have that ritual of ostracism, or that tradition of ostracism, that every year you vote democratically on who gets banished, and banish one person from the city, and Hermodorus gets banished. Now, he's Heraclitus's friend. One of Heraclitus's fragments is the Ephesians would be better off to end their own lives because they have banished Hermodorus, who was one of the best and brightest among us. I don't recall the exact phrasing, but the reason why Heraclitus is so upset by this is because he sees Hermodorus as one of their best and brightest citizens, and he looks at how democracy has sort of manifested in the Greek culture, and you get things like this practice of ostracism, where, as Nietzsche would later write, what often happened was that the best or most, like whoever was dominating in a given art or craft or field of endeavor would often be the one who got banished, because then it would open up the competition again. Like, it's no fun when Magnus Carlsen wins the chess world championship every single time, because he's always the one who's going to win. Or who Michael Phelps, best Olympic swimmer. Would it be better if he just stepped aside and somebody else came in? Or you open the possibility for somebody else to come in? And so this would often happen. And Heraclitus doesn't really comment on the political background, the geopolitical background of Hermodorus's banishment. He just sort of sees that dynamic, and it's very implicit. The thing about Heraclitus is that all of his writings come to us through fragments. He's very similar to Lao Tzu in that way, because he leaves us these really sort of laconic, koan-like statements where you can read so much meaning into them, but because the context is so lacking, it opens itself up to so many different interpretations. So people have interpreted Heraclitus all these different ways. But with all of those caveats, there is that sense in Heraclitus that he gives up on the civic life, on the democratic life of the Greeks. And Nietzsche says that the Greeks were like the political men par excellence. So it's particularly unusual for him to do this. The reason why Nietzsche says that is because all the Greeks in some way represent their polis. So even when they're at the Olympic Games competing between athletes, you're a stand-in for your city. And Heraclitus, after this incident, or maybe it's just sort of like the straw that breaks the camel's back, says, I'm done with this. And famously, he's found at the Temple of Artemis. Some of the leading citizens go looking for him, and he's playing knucklebones with the children, a kind of dice game, ancient dice game. And they say, why are you doing this? And he says, isn't it better to do this than to participate in your civic life? And he then leads this life of sort of obscurity. And he dies of natural causes. He has like some sort of internal ailment. I forget exactly how he dies, but he lives to old age. And basically, as a man who, unlike Diogenes, lives entirely outside of society as a kind of bum or a vagrant, and he's not a rebel. He's not at war with society. He's within his society, but not a part of his society. And what he leaves us in terms of his philosophy, the reason why he's significant among the pre-Socratics or the pre-Platonics, is because he provides this philosophy of change. So all of the Greek philosophers are, the unity amongst them is that they're all trying to answer this question, what exists? They're trying to name the arche. They're trying to say, what is the one thing that endures? What is it, therefore, that's eternal? Because what is what is, not what will be or what was. So what is the thing that we can say exists? And Heraclitus, the implicit notion throughout his writings is that transformation is the thing that's eternal and the thing that continues to exist. Change is eternal, we might say. And he says that even though this law of change, this logos, is readily discernible to all men, they choose not to see it, or they're just unable to see it. And that's what I mean when I say he's a prideful man. Nietzsche's reading of Heraclitus is he's a man who only trusts in his own discernment. He doesn't trust in popular opinion. He doesn't trust in institutions. He laughs at inherited wisdom. He says all the Dionysian revelers don't know that Dionysus is one and the same with Hades. So the god they're worshiping is actually the same as the god of the underworld. He says that, and their rites, they're purifying themselves with blood. That's like using muck to take a shower in. And anyone with any sense would see that doesn't make any sense. He says that Hesiod's kind of an idiot. He says that Homer and Archilochus should be like turned out and whipped. So these are like the great poets, and Hesiod provides us with like a cosmology, an explanation of where the world comes from. Heraclitus basically thinks these people are all idiots. He only trusts in his own discernment, and it's similar to saying he trusts in his intuition, but it's more like saying he trusts in the direct apprehension of his senses and his perception. And this is really significant to Nietzsche, because the way I would describe it is that Heraclitus does offer a metaphysics, but what it is it's a metaphysics that does an about face from the intelligible world and turns back to appearance. And so many of the other philosophers at this time, they're trying to describe, what being is, what truly exists. They end up creating this intelligible world. They're trying to describe it in terms of the world of abstract concepts. Heraclitus, his metaphysics has the effect of turning away from that and turning back towards what we directly perceive. And what he directly perceives in the world is this change, is this flux. There's these numerous, I pulled up one of them actually, fragments about this. This is 67. He says, God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, surfeit and hunger, but he takes various shapes, just as fire, when it is mingled with spices, is named according to the savor of each. So, like you burn incense, we name the smoke that the fire gives off according to the savor of it, or whatever is burned, or something like that. And so there he's talking about the God, the one, as this thing that transforms. And, one of his most famous aphorisms is that this world was neither made by gods nor men, but is an ever-living fire that's kindled in some places and snuffed out in others. And so, yeah, that would be my introduction to Heraclitus, that he gives us a metaphysics of change, and that when asked what is eternal, he tells us that transformation is eternal. And when asked sort of like what to describe the world in intelligible terms, turns us back toward the senses. And at the very least, that's how, like, Heidegger reads Heraclitus very differently, for example, but that's Nietzsche's reading of Heraclitus, and it's one that I happen to agree with.
I really like in your explication, or basically your recounting of the narrative of his life, his relationship with Hermodorus. I'm sorry. Hermodorus is the, I almost did not put two and two together. The idea that we could democratically banish one person from the city each year might be the reason that he comes down pretty hard on democracy. And that's something that I definitely want to put a pin in, and maybe we'll move that to the end of the discussion. But before I do that, I'll have maybe Devin say a few comments, maybe fill in a few blanks, or, shift the focus to something else that you think stands out to you in his work.
No, I think Keegan already took everything that I had planned to say, just laid it all out. No, that was a fantastic introduction. I think that was I was actually going to refer kind of as the first thing to a passage in Twilight of the Idols, where Nietzsche makes explicitly the same argument that Keegan was just kind of laying out, where he says he kind of makes this great exception for Heraclitus among philosophers. And he says, when all the other philosophical folk threw out the testimony of the senses because it showed multiplicity and change, Heraclitus threw it out because it made things look permanent and unified. And what the passage suggests is what actually I think is a central concern of Nietzsche's philosophy throughout, which isn't just this theme of becoming, but this question of how life, how error and illusion are necessary conditions of life. And the root of error and illusion is, in some way, conceptual thinking, which operates through a principle of identity. Concepts equate essentially different things to one another. And this is also manifest in the sort of opposition between being and becoming, where if we take as primary a kind of endless stream of becoming, then there are in principle no identical things in reality. This is the concept of identical things is rather an error that life presupposes. And you see him already articulating, I think, in important ways, this idea early on in philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks when he discusses Heraclitus. And what you see is a really interesting fusion of Heraclitus with Kant and Schopenhauer. So he particularly talks about Heraclitus as this intuitive thinker, which I think Keegan also anticipated here. And intuition here has like a very specific meaning. In the Kantian system, it is directly opposed to concepts. And when he cites Schopenhauer to this effect in the discussion of Heraclitus, part of what Nietzsche is trying to get at is this idea that in the world of appearances, everything that we encounter exists in flux according to the senses, right? That in some sense, we have to establish some kind of condition of intelligibility that relies upon concepts and identity. But what we directly encounter through the senses is this perpetual flux. And both Nietzsche and Heraclitus are trying to, I would argue, trying to think through a kind of metaphysics or ontology. I think ontology would be the better term because it really is a meditation on the concept of being and its relation to becoming, but one in which singularity and becoming are taken as these fundamental terms of the world of appearances, and identity, conceptual identity, is an illusion or error that is imposed upon these, even though it's a necessary one, and turning about our entire axis of thinking in that respect. And I think one reason to pay attention to Nietzsche's interest in Heraclitus here is there's all kinds of debate that I think people get into, particularly in Anglo-American scholarship on Nietzsche, about, what does Nietzsche mean? For example, I'm talking about this idea of falsifying of life requiring errors. Well, doesn't that seem to presuppose that we have some ultimate idea of reality that we compare, these errors to in order to say that they're false? And there are many people who argue that Nietzsche gets into this kind of self-reference problem where when he's talking about being and becoming in this way, right? He says that certain things, certain categories of being are errors, but that seems to presuppose that you have some metaphysical access to the thing in itself. And we know that Nietzsche was challenging this thinking from early on. But I think if we focus on Heraclitus, we see that this kind of epistemological framing misses that there is this deep interest in radically thinking being in terms of becoming, right? To think the cat, as Keegan was anticipating, the category of the one as expressing itself qua flux and qua action. And that is something that he really emphasizes in the Heraclitus discussion of philosophy of the Tragic Age of Greeks. And I think a lot of Anglo-American scholarship misses this, and the focus on Heraclitus can help to bring it out. I could go into a whole spiel about eternal return cosmology, because I think that's what this directly leads into, is his attempts to prove cosmologically the eternal recurrence. But I'll hold off on that for a little later when we actually come to it more organically.
Well, I'll have Keegan respond to that, and then we'll just go to Will and Adam for each one of the individual questions. So yeah, go ahead, Keegan.
Yeah, a lot of when Devin was talking just now, what I thought of, I pulled this quote from Nietzsche's Lectures on the Pre-Platonics, it's a related text to the Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. A lot of philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks seems to be based on the Pre-Platonic lectures, but there's a lot there that's not included. But I'll read a quote from his lecture on Heraclitus, where he says, quote, "Thus the one overall becoming is itself law. That it becomes and how it becomes is its work. Heraclitus thus sees only the one, but in the sense opposite to Parmenides. All qualities of things, all laws, all generation and destruction are the continual revelation of the existence of the one. Multiplicity, which is a deception of the sense, according to Parmenides, is for Heraclitus the cloth, the form of appearance of the one, in no way a deception. Otherwise, the one does not appear at all." End quote. And so it's this idea that being, to the extent that it's actually, there's sort of a relation to Hegel here that I don't think was intentional at all, in the sense of, I'm trying to think of the German word, Erscheinung, appearance, basically, which doesn't have, it has a different connotation in German of something like shines forth, basically. And so the way in which the one appears, or being appears, is in becoming. The change, the transformation, the flux is the cloth of being. And there's another excerpt from that lecture where Nietzsche says, Heraclitus doesn't reduce the many to the one The many is the one. So there is no, in the sense that like Thales said that everything is water, he's sort of trying to come up with like a primordial form of matter, a sort of underlying unity to matter. And oftentimes he'll be contrasted with Heraclitus, where they'll say, well, Heraclitus said everything is fire. But there's a very different sense in which Heraclitus thinks that everything is fire. And that fire is energy. It's really what he's trying to get across with the image of fire is that fire is something that arises and passes away. That quite literally, if you just put yourself into the perspective of somebody living in an ancient Greek polis, you would have an example in the metaphor of fire of something coming into being and then going out of being, at least in terms of the appearance, right? And that's how Heraclitus sees the world is, all these phenomenon or individual forces that actually do arise and pass away. So this is before an understanding of the conservation of mass and conservation of energy, by the way. Heraclitus actually thinks that whole worlds get destroyed in this endless cycle of becoming. But there is no underlying essential intelligible reality behind that, is the key distinction. And when Nietzsche brings up Parmenides, I think it was Joel Zwan in this essay that I read about this, or paper I read about this, that he sees Parmenides and Heraclitus as sort of the centerpiece of philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks, and points out that the animosity that Nietzsche creates between them is not necessarily something that they felt towards each other. I mean, they are near contemporaries. They don't write with the intention of refuting one another. They are contrasted quite often, however, because the Parmenidean school, the Eleatics, they put forward the complete opposing viewpoint that, in Nietzsche in the same lectures, he says, the revelation comes to Parmenides one day. What is, what is not, which sounds tautological, but it's his realization that all the time we talk about things that don't exist. We talk about non-being. We talk about nothingness. And that leads him as a sort of logical imperative to deny becoming, because change therefore would be impossible, because for something to become what it was not, you're saying that it basically is following sort of the law of conservation of mass in a way, conservation of matter. Nietzsche actually sees that as a contribution of Parmenides. Possibly the one contribution is that later the atomists like Democritus actually took seriously his idea of matter being sort of like indestructible or something of that nature. But Democritus's innovation was saying that there was atoms and void. Well, the Eleatics deny that there's void, because that would mean that there's non-being. Therefore, there can't be motion, because there's no negative space for objects to move through. So then, therefore, the fact that we see motion with our senses must mean that the senses are deluded. And, we're all familiar with Zeno's paradox. He tries to demonstrate this mathematically. But if you sort of metaphysically buy into the idea of what Nietzsche calls the metaphysics of pure being, that what is and what is not cannot be, you would have to deny motion. And then you're in this really weird position of denying the senses in favor of this intelligible story of being. And it comes from, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because much of what Devin was saying about sort of the equating of unequal things and word concepts, or we might say like the essentializing trait of the conceptual world, that when we have like a general word concept of a tree or a mountain or a river or something like that, it doesn't refer to any specific thing, and it actually can't refer to any specific thing. It does actually possess a sort of essence in the Platonic sense, like the Platonic ideal. The mistake of people like Plato and Parmenides in the eyes of Nietzsche is that they're thinking that the operations of the mind in the world of abstract concepts must be the operations of the material world as well, or the perceptual world. They're sort of interposing, again, what Devin was saying is sort of like an error of consciousness, an inherent error of consciousness, of investing duration into things, or an essence, or a unity, which in a way we might say it holds something up, a phenomena, independently. So, like if you read Spinoza, for example, who's really influential on Nietzsche, he points out no phenomena is actually independent. Every phenomena that we encounter is in some sense dependent on other things as causes and conditions of its existence. The only thing that's truly independent would be the unity, the totality, nature itself. But all the modi are dependent. But in the terms of like a word concept that you hold in your mind, you can hold it up independently, in a sense. And so, yeah, because we believe these sort of essentializing traits, or we have this sort of operation to the way concepts are formed. The mistake of the Parmenideans is to, as a sort of logical axiom, apply that to the material world. And Heraclitus's brilliance, in some sense, is that he does turn back to the world of the senses. He doesn't systematically tell us this, but virtually every aphorism in Heraclitus is constantly reminding us of perspective and transformation. Including, I mean, the most famous one is one does not step into the same river twice, for there ever fresh waters flowing, something of that nature. And the interesting thing about that aphorism is that he's not saying the river doesn't exist. In some sense, he's saying the reason why the river exists is because it's becoming, not because it's static being. If the river was not constantly changing,
this is the key move, I think, that you're.
Yeah, if it was the same waters,
Parmenidean affirmation, right? Parmenides has this kind of intuition that's almost, I see it as almost an early version of the ontological argument. Like, if there's one being whose essence involves existence, it's being, right? Being can't fail to be. We have to have this primordial affirmation of it. We can't negate it. And he infers from that, because we use non-being to describe time, that time must not exist and change must not exist. And you can see, I think, you've been laying out, Heraclitus then reverses this to say, well, the only being that we're ever acquainted with is appearances, and appearances are always in flux, appearances are always changing. So this primordial affirmation flips, where the necessity to affirm being means that we have to affirm time and change as the fundamental condition of being, right? Rather than as some illusion that the illusion switches from, becoming to being, where being is this necessary illusion for maintaining some kind of stability of life amidst endless becoming, right?
Yeah, that was you wrapped it up better than I could have. And the one thing that comes to mind is that same aphorism you read in Twilight of Idols, where he says, I think at the end, Heraclitus will remain eternally correct, that being is an empty fiction. That, which I think if you really grapple with that, it's one of those things that's almost, that sentence is again like a Zen koan to me, because it will radically transform the way you see the world.
One other quick note, just on something you said before turning it to Will and Adam, but the Hegel connection with shine. The word, when Nietzsche speaks of illusion, particularly in the early works, the German word being translated as illusion is shine. What we miss there is this etymological connection between shine and shinen, to appear, the verb for to appear, right? And it's clear that Nietzsche is playing on that in a similar way to Hegel, I think, early on when we talk about illusion. But when we translate shine as illusion, we kind of lose that resonance that is there in the German, that I think Nietzsche is playing with deliberately.
Go for it, Will.
Yeah, I think if we're going to talk about Nietzsche and Heraclitus, I find it interesting that so far the discussion of what Heraclitus reveals to Nietzsche about history has been missing. In the second meditation, right, it's Heraclitus that that reveals to Nietzsche the limitation of the Delphic instruction, this basis upon which all of Western philosophy has lied in this question of the seaton, right? The know thyself, which has produced everything from a philosophy of history as the unfolding of subjectivity in relation to a perceivable truth, right? So there's this Heraclitean understanding, or this crypto-Hegelian understanding of Heraclitus, right? You have that rather silly articulation of Heraclitus as kind of the grandfather of the dialectic, right? Or Heraclitus is this remarkable metaphysician of opposites. But Nietzsche's going to make a much more fundamental and foundational claim that's going to set forth, really, I think, the basic argument of the uses and abuses of history, which I think is, if you're interested in Nietzsche as violator of history, this is, I think, as important as the second part of the genealogy. The Delphic cry, "Know thyself," and he then responds with the Heraclitean fragment on "things are as concealed as they are disconcealed," right? And this this idea that Heraclitus is this remarkable thinker of interiority, because I've excavated myself. The famous repeat is, "I've searched myself. I've mined myself." But what we often forget is we find as much dirt as we do gold, right? When we do this. So Nietzsche wants to sort of play with this account of Heraclitus as the pre-Socratic founder of philosophy, and this is why the importance of that polemic pre-Platonic is so important, because Plato is the great organizer of all of these varying articulations of being. To say ontology, to say phenomena, like, these are terms that would not be known to thinkers like Heraclitus. I think it was Eugen Fink or Heidegger who was like, this whole dialectical reading of Heraclitus is silly because, like, Heraclitus knows nothing of dialectic or opposite. And Nietzsche has essentially the same reading. Now, Nietzsche and Heidegger, who I think are the two, most frequently casually cited interpreters of Heraclitus, have, I think, remarkably different understandings. But I think they both pin the same importance on Heraclitus, in as much as he's really one of the indicators of a symptom in philosophy, in as much as he negates it. Heraclitus is almost always bounced off of a particular malignant tendency in Western philosophy for both Heidegger and Nietzsche, but also Eugene Fink in those late seminars. I know both Craig and I read those for this. But what I want to talk about is not just Heraclitus as a philosopher who's, again, going to be bounced off of this supposed falseness of appearance, right, in favor of this excavation of interiority that then can reveal the unfolding of subjectivity that can one day align with the truth. There's also this strange element of revelation as sort of the process through which truth and revelation stand beside one another here. And I'm thinking of the way in which both Heraclitus and Nietzsche, I don't really want to worry about Heidegger's use of this, both Nietzsche and Heraclitus use the concept of the Thunderbolt. Heidegger's preoccupied with steering, obviously, for reasons regarding his critique of technology, right? Like the Thunderbolt, Kybernetes, it steers all, right? And of course, cybernetics steers all for Heidegger. But for the Thunderbolt, for both Nietzsche and Heraclitus, is going to be this remarkably ephemeral thing, right? And it's going to both come down to a conception of experience, and I don't mean this in like the Leibniz sort of like experiential 19th century philosophy sort of way, but there's going to be this false attribution of the Thunderbolt to the entirety of again this concept of an interiority that must always, in the end, find itself kind of papered over, or at least establish a foundation between subjectivity and fundamental truth, but in this, again, this organized chaos. So I think that if there is something that Heraclitus and Nietzsche share, it's going to be a kind of remarkable skepticism as it pertains to the possibility of a stable category of truth and of self-knowledge, because Heraclitus doesn't ever claim that he knows himself, but claims that he has searched himself, that he has had access, that he's dug into himself. And I think that it's that archival element that both Nietzsche and Heraclitus share as it pertains to this concept of interiority. Not that there has to be some exhaustible final positive truth, because now we know that the logos is inexhaustible. It's a principle that can never be a principle. There's always just simply going to be phenomena, and then sort of this void that has to be searched, but nonetheless can never be exhausted, or one can never make a final conclusion about. And in that way, I think Heraclitus is sort of helpful for Nietzsche as a stopgap for philosophy as final judger of history.
What do you think, Keegan? Is Heraclitus the godfather or grandfather of the dialectic? Are you with Nietzsche? Oh, you're muted. Go ahead and try again.
Right. Yeah, no, I don't know if I would agree with that one, because he doesn't seem I think the dialectic is sort of precluded by being such a solitary thinker in a way. But the interesting remarks you were Will making about history and about, what did you say, sort of like the illusion of interiority, or the illusion of or the misperception of some sort of stable, like continuous concept. What I was thinking of in that is that it's not in philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks, but in Nietzsche's lectures in the pre-Platonics. So there's a really interesting thread in those lectures that involves Nietzsche's understanding of physics. It's a very little known aspect of Nietzsche, but Whitlock, who translated those lectures, has an extensive commentary on it, trying to sort of disentangle what Nietzsche's getting at. And he points out that in almost every one of the lectures where he's talking about the pre-Platonics, he will bring in some sort of corollary with science that has happened in the modern era, in Enlightenment science. And so in one sense, he's sort of showing almost like a, we might say that there's maybe perhaps a recursive structure to science. But I think the specific point on Heraclitus is why I brought this up, because he brings up this pulse rate thought experiment by this guy von Baer, who's a scientist and philosopher of science. And there was a notion at the time, so coming out of the Neo-Kantian school, there was actually quite a bit of scientific experimentation done according to, like, with hypotheses that were formed along Neo-Kantian lines. That Kant opens up this whole idea that the phenomenal world that you're receiving is conditioned by your sense apparatus. And so if you have a being, say, like a different kind of animal with a different sense apparatus, maybe they're perceiving a different world. You can see this in Nietzsche's work too. There's that, I believe it's a note in Will to Power, where he says, if we had had a use for sensing the electrical field, we would have a sense organ for that. But we didn't find any sort of way to heighten our survivability by sensing the electrical. But that doesn't mean, like, just because we're not directly sensing it, it doesn't mean it's not real, right? So there's this sort of phenomena, noumena influence on scientific thought. And one of so what Nietzsche references in the Heraclitus lecture is this thought experiment by von Baer. They had this notion that the speed at which an organism's physiology operates is the speed at which they're perceiving existence. And what that would mean would be, if you have a faster pulse rate, which does seem to be the case with like smaller organisms, they would literally be experiencing a faster reality. Like their physiology is just moving at a quote unquote faster speed than our own. And so von Baer basically says, okay, let's take this to the extreme. Like, let's imagine that there could be beings with like 1,000,000 times the pulse rate of a human being. Let's imagine one with 1/1,000,000th of our pulse rate, extremely slow, extremely fast, And Nietzsche describes this in depth in the Heraclitus lecture, basically saying, at an extremely fast perception of time, you would see the seasons wheel past you. The trees would fruit, and then the leaves would fall off, and then they would grow again in seconds. And the important thing isn't so much whether that pans out scientifically, which I don't think it does, but that it raises this issue of the illusion of duration, because it draws your attention to the idea that what we attribute duration to is just a different perception of finitude. So it's all finitude, right? In the flux, everything is finite or temporary or transitory, we might say, transforming constantly. And we'll look at certain phenomena and say, well, that's been there my entire life. This is a stable, continuous thing with duration. But the point of that von Baer is making is, perhaps from another perspective of a being with a different perception of time than your own, that same phenomenon has no duration, or as little duration to them as a spark flying off from the campfire does to you. Right? It's there and then it's gone. And this brings in perspectivism and relativity into so it basically means that you're sort of like at the extremes. You could sort of compound every, what would you say? Every phenomenon with apparent duration from the perspective of a god, we might say, is equally finite. And so this leads into this very peculiar idea then that duration is a sort of illusion. Now, that brings Heraclitus and Nietzsche dangerously close to denying the senses in another way, in the opposite way of Parmenides. But again, the issue, I think the counter to that would be, it's not actually a denial of the senses. It's a denial of our conceptions. It's a denial of our conscious construal of what those senses mean, of the intermediary considerations that we have formed after the fact of those sense impressions. And Nietzsche, the only place where he really elaborates on this is in the Time Atomism fragment, which is a very fascinating document that I don't understand. You could look into it.
Drawings too.
Yeah, there's some little diagrams and
the dots and some.
Yeah, it's also very clearly like the denial of the first Hegelian postulate of consciousness, which any student like sense certainty, right? Like there can be sense and not this entire epiphenomenal universal human certainty.
Yeah, I agree. Well, and I think so, to bring it back around to the point you were making about history, I think a lot of Nietzsche's, for lack of a better word, I'll just put it in vulgar terms, like his individualism and his focus on like affirming your own life as you live it down to the last detail, I think has to do with this idea that he does see history in some sense from that same angle, that this is all a flux anyway. It has no goal. It has no final cause. It has no resting place. And, all of the, these epochs and eras of mankind don't have duration anyway. And there's this, Deleuze is really good about bringing this out, that, Nietzsche, he has several passages where he'll talk about like, Well, this there's like a passage in the Gay Science where he's talking about how the more masculine types are better at preserving the state and the civilization, whereas in Europe we've clearly had more dominant feminine types because we've had all these like sort of we're prone to narcotics, both of alcohol and opiates, but also of the spiritual variety, and that's caused this great dissatisfaction in Europe. It's a lot to untangle in that passage, but the point is, it's not at all clear that, because the counterexample he gives is in China, this very masculine sort of patriarchal society. They've done a great deal to maintain their social relationships and maintain their social mores and so on and so forth. It's not clear that Nietzsche is actually saying that's a good thing. And in many ways, what Deleuze zeroes in on is that there's like a sort of folly in trying to like preserve or hold on to something like a social arrangement or a even like a civilization. This links back to Heraclitus in a way that it's not clear that Nietzsche really gives a damn about the polis. And that's why I've always thought of him as not really a political thinker, because if you're not invested in the polis, it's very hard to be political. But it's because he sees the illusion of the duration of that polis. And I'm trying to think, I've been trying to grasp how Deleuze puts it. I think it's where he's saying that like it might be in the preface, his preface to the English translation, where he says like every nation has their own way of reactivity. And he talks about sort of like German nationalism and French romanticism. Nietzsche doesn't actually have a whole lot of regard for these attempts to, he sees it sort of like trying to live in a way that you preserve your own life, like the last man sort of ideal of, I just want to go through life passively and live as long as possible and die a peaceful death, right? That, no matter what, you are going to go under. And so you ought to do it. You have a finite amount of time no matter what, so you ought to spend it well. And so I think that is these apparently metaphysical or obscure considerations that Nietzsche have a lot to do with why he's not so concerned with history, with a political project, why he says the free spirit should stand aside from these things in some sense. So, that would be my reaction, I guess.
Before I take it to Adam, I just want to shout out the podcast, do a little call sign here. This is Acid Horizon with Keegan Kjeldsen from the Nietzsche Podcast, talking about Heraclitus and Nietzsche. And one more thing that I want to do is announce the winner of the contest that we had on Twitter for the free Crit Drip, which is the merch store. And the winner, if you're listening, and we'll announce it later, is Throne of Dusts, at Throne Dusts. So you can head to critdrip.com and pick out one t-shirt, and I will send it to you, and I'll be in touch with you. And also, if you're interested in supporting the podcast, the first thing you want to do is become a patron on Acid Horizon Podcast on patreon.com. We have reading groups there. We will soon be starting a reading group on Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, Pierre Klasowski, and also critdrip.com is having a sale this weekend. So that's a way that you can support us. And with that said, I'm going to take it to our own Adam, who's going to give up his offering. Go for it, Adam.
This is my offerings to the Temple of Artemis. Yes, in terms of the question of the relationship of Heraclitus to dialectics, he's a thinker who's very sort of vulnerable to certain dialectical inversions. Now, what I mean by that is, so one of the most underrated readers of Heraclitus actually is Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard in The Ending of Theory and Trembling, where he talks about a student of Heraclitus who basically he does what he thinks Hegel does to Christianity, which is he misses the wood for the trees in trying to submit this thought to a very sort of philosophical method. It inverts its content. So how this works is the student of Heraclitus, I can't remember his name, I don't think Kierkegaard actually names him. So he's listening to Heraclitus say, Panta re, everything flows, you cannot step in the same river twice. And then the student, trying to be a good disciple of the master, trying to stick with their thinking, says, I have taken this even further, I have now proven with this, that therefore you cannot step into the same river once. And Kierkegaard says, this is philosophically the way to take it, in a way, because if you're going to argue dialectically, you're going to say that, in a way, you can't step in the same river once. That is a negation of identity, and therefore that negation even negates itself, because identity cannot form, because there's just a flow there. Nothing actually, nothing actually fixes itself. So then, this was the interesting part. Kierkegaard basically says, well, okay, you've reinvented being Parmenides, because the motion, that was the point. Not the philosophical principle, not the simple logical conceptual axis of identity. The motion was the point, and when you've lost emotion, you've lost the struggle. And that's there, I think, as Keegan, as you were saying, there's an element of a method there in returning to the senses, because the senses are essentially the mediation, the factor through which everything flows through them. Everything flows through the senses. Even everyone from Kant to Nietzsche to Deleuze to Hume all pick this up, you know. And I'm wondering to that extent, is Heraclitus in a way a kind of an empiricist to that extent? Is there a method in Heraclitus, at least in these fragments we have of his, that we can say that Nietzsche maybe takes up? Is Nietzsche in a way the fulfillment of, at least from the fragments, that kind of Heraclitean empiricist method of sort of thinking about the principle of our senses being change in a way? Yeah, to go a bit cybernetic with it, you know, what makes sense is a difference that makes a difference. It's what actually is detected when we're looking for it.
Yeah, I don't remember the name of this person either, but it's in a Platonic dialogue, I believe, where it's a follower of Heraclitus who says, actually, you can't even step into the same river once. And it's funny. So I don't know if Nietzsche directly, I don't recall where he directly ties Heraclitus to empiricism, but what he does say with Parmenides, the man who comes to this sort of opposite conclusion, is that all empiricism halts with Parmenides. And that's why Nietzsche agrees with Aristotle in saying Parmenides isn't even a natural philosopher, because he basically, by totally denying the senses, empiricism is dead. He says Nietzsche, I believe the turn of phrase is, he tied off the veins of empiricism. And so with Heraclitus, I would agree that he is like an empirical thinker in that way. I think he's always been misread, because another thing that Aristotle says, this time against Heraclitus, is that Aristotle construes Heraclitus as a thinker of opposites, as a thinker who Aristotle basically says, look, the natural philosophers go wrong, and the example that he uses of that is Heraclitus. They go wrong because they see the change and transformation in the natural world, and then they break the law of non-contradiction, therefore, by assuming that a thing must contain its opposite. And he uses Heraclitus as the chief example of this. And he actually, I believe Aristotle cites the fragment I mentioned earlier, 67, of Heraclitus sort of saying, like, the God is all of these transformations, which are opposites. I think the reason why that's a misreading, which I think Nietzsche is very keen on, is because there's a misunderstanding of perspectivism. And I think one of the best fragments for getting at this is a really simple one, where Heraclitus says the way up and the way down are the same road. And what that means, I think, or the way I would read it quite plainly, is that if you're standing at the bottom of the road up the mountain, that's the way up. And if you're standing at the top, it's the way down, but they're the same road. It depends on where your vantage point is. But up and down are opposites, right? And so that's another way in which Heraclitus is very similar to Lao Tzu, because when Lao Tzu says, I believe it's in the second part of the Tao Te Ching, that like front and back depend on each other, up and down depend on each other. We have like this relativity in our language that's based on this perceived opposition. Well, it's right there, what I just said, it's relative, right? And that the oppositeness of these two phenomena is not in the phenomena, it's in your perception of them. And another great one is that the donkey prefers straw to gold, which is like, okay, it's a truism, Heraclitus. But it's like, if you think about it, it's like, okay, but the human beings, especially around his time when gold is still, the main currency, obviously they prefer gold to straw. But the donkey doesn't have any perception of that. Or there's another one, that dogs bark at people that they don't know. That's sort of like, the same person. If the dog knows him, he doesn't bark. He comes right up to him. If the dog doesn't know him, he barks at him. Again, it's not as if the person contains two opposite people, a nice man and an evil man. It's simply a matter of the dog that perceives him, right? And so, yeah, I think he is an empirical thinker. I think that he's kind of been maybe misrepresented as being, I don't want to use the term like irrationalist or something like that, but that, the Aristotelian way of thinking and way of approaching the world tends to look at thinkers who accept a sort of ontology of, what would you say, an ontology that takes into account perspective and relativity. They see that as inherently sort of irrational or undermining to their entire project of making the world reasonable. And so I think that's what's maybe kept thinkers like Heraclitus from being usually included within that milieu, because there's always this perception of like, oh, well, isn't he breaking the law of non-contradiction? So the whole thing, you can kind of argue anything, right? It's like, I don't think that's really true. I think a lot of what Heraclitus says is directly, yeah, I'll hand it over to Devin.
If I may just pick up on that, because I think there's a Nietzsche passage that helps here from Philosophy and the Tragic Age of the Greeks, where he specifically addresses this issue from this objection from Aristotle. And I also think it relates to Adam's question about the empirical. So Nietzsche's explanation here, in response to Aristotle's objection that Heraclitus has sinned against the law of contradiction, is that, but intuitive thinking embraces two things. One, the present many-colored and changing world that crowds in upon us in all our experiences. And two, the conditions which alone make any experience of this world possible, time and space. So here he's making this explicitly Kantian and Schopenhauerian move, right? Where in the transcendental aesthetic, in intuition, the forms of time and space, and thus also of relation and representation, are already given, right? And he proceeds to sort of lay out, and I think in compact fashion, the kind of argument that he will, I think, repeatedly try to prove empirically by drawing from what at least Nietzsche considered to be the scientific evidence of his time. And I think there's reason to think that he wanted to extrapolate on some of these considerations more, but didn't quite feel himself competent as a scientist. But he goes on to explicitly make the argument, and space is just like time, and everything which coexists in space and time has but a relative existence, and each thing exists through and for another like it, which is to say through and for another equally relative one. And this is a truth of the greatest immediate self-evidence for everyone. But whoever finds himself directly looking at it must at once move on to the Heraclitean conclusion and say that the whole nature of reality, Wirklichkeit, lies simply in its acts, Wirken, and that for it there exists no other sort of being. And then he proceeds to an extensive quote from Schopenhauer. But you can see the sort of chain of reasoning that he's trying to lay out there, that once we take this Heraclitean move, we are going to have to admit that the world structured by the senses, the world of appearances, the only reality you encounter there is one of action, and the kind of temporary durability is only produced by kind of relative speed or slowness of action, right? And the kind of examples that Keegan was evincing, right? The mountain has been there for my entire life; it endures, but of course, it's always changing in an absolute sense. It's just that my sense of duration is different on some level. And I think that this is what will eventually become the kind of arguments he makes for will to power and eternal recurrence when he talks about, for example, taking basically the same core intuition from Parmenides and Heraclitus to a reasoning about force and the nature of force, that it's kind of unthinkable to imagine a force that does not at all times express itself, because it is simply in the nature of force to do so. That is its kind of fundamental tendency or will to power. And you can see the same kernel of this Parmenidean and then also Heraclitean affirmation of being, except now an affirmation of being as change in its most fundamental way. And I do think that one of the reasons it's interesting to look at these early fragments is, there is this common view that Nietzsche didn't take the cosmological proofs of the eternal recurrence seriously. And one kind of argument in favor of this, aside from the fact that he doesn't, see fit to publish this in his actual published books, is that, they're somehow just kind of isolated. There are only a few of them. What you see here is these pretty much the same core reflections on metaphysics that he is at each case trying to kind of tie into the physics of his time. And I think it shows that it's a really more enduring preoccupation for him. And when he comes back and attributes, says that Heraclitus in Twilight, or I think it's actually in Ecce Homo, I tweeted this quote earlier today, when he says that Heraclitus could have already kind of understood the eternal recurrence. I think he's drawing a very direct connection between what he is attempting at the time and those kind of physical and cosmological arguments and what he is thinking about early on with regards to Heraclitus.
I have a really brief note on the German term Wirklichkeit, that there's that another connotation in German, like the place where force acts, where being acts, that's where it works, right? That's where being happens. Again,
exactly. Yeah.
The cloth of the one is appearance.
And you can see pretty easily how Nietzsche would want to cash that out in terms of physics and force performing work, in the moment of expressing itself. Like, there are very clear connections you can make there. And that's where it does, in some cases, become a kind of empirical case. And maybe it's not entirely clear how he reconciles. And Heidegger, for example, is somebody who wants to take the ontological dimension of these reflections seriously, but kind of dismiss any connection to the natural science. And maybe Nietzsche didn't ultimately arrive at a comfortable way of marrying the two, but I definitely think he was trying to.
Yeah, it's I would just give as another note Boscovich, like the work of Roger Boscovich is
Boscovich is huge. The force idea of force centers, this concept that he repeatedly talks about, even in the published works, of the kind of atomistic illusion, that even the idea that the fundamental constituents of reality are just these little lumps of stuff rather than units of force or action, is a kind of metaphysical prejudice. That at least is a very common theme for him, I think.
Yeah, the passage in Beyond Good and Evil, I believe it is, where he says, "Even your atom, my dear physicists." It's
exactly
like the last remnant of the soul. And that's one of those lines when you first read Nietzsche, you're like, what the fuck is he talking about? But it makes sense. It's like you're trying to find the smallest unit of being so that you can say that the bedrock, the foundation of phenomenal existence, is stuff, like some kind of substance, basically, or essence. And that's why Nietzsche gravitates towards Boscovich, which believes it's force. It's like a wave. All the phenomena of reality are the same waveform manifesting at different speeds. And Boscovich believes
in
in
a finite amount too, importantly.
Yes, yeah.
Which turns out to be very important for his, conception
right.
of force repeating itself.
And the idea of like action at a distance and some of Boscovich's ideas is still very controversial. But from my understanding, Boscovich is kind of having like a revival in physics these days, where a lot of people are very interested in his ideas. So yeah, that's another thing to look into, but it's a deep rabbit hole. And if you're like mathematically or scientifically challenged like I am, it's very difficult to look into it. But and it's very hard. I have. If anyone out there is a physicist and you want to do a video explaining Boscovich, that would be great, because there's very little on it out there. So
I would love to actually talk to a real theoretical physicist.
Yes, me too.
Because I'm totally inept, obviously, in that, but it would be fascinating.
A lot of the sort of debates in Germany and around the philosophy of science, particularly the philosophy of chemistry, were very much following this kind of, I would say, Heraclitean, but very action-focused kind of direction. I mean, even just thinking about someone like Schelling and his nature philosophy. So Schelling's, the big transcendental critique of all of the atomists was, you have this billiard ball model of interacting units, but the argument from Schelling and others is well, what unifies the units? And we know this now physically. We know force unifies the strong and weak nuclear force. The force is actually the condition of possibility for that unity, and therefore the unity is a kind of a meta-stability. I mean, even thinking about, because Nietzsche was writing this sort of pre-Mendeleev, there's no periodic table here. And looking at some of the debates between, for example, like Lesage and people like Laplace and Schelling, and I was picking up one of the things that I think is very interesting to pick up there is that a lot of the things we now know as sort of isolated or sort of abstracted substances, like the elements, were not substances before they were first principles. I mean, occasionally you'll read in Schelling's nature philosophy, the ideas for a philosophy of nature, he'll talk about the principle of oxygen. And I'm like, what do you mean the principle of oxygen? Why the fuck is it the principle? No, it's stuff. We breathe it in. Of course, he didn't know this. And then I was looking at, okay, oxygen, take the etymology. It's acid generation. It's the principle of activity which gives you the sort of spark that allows fire to come into existence. That's why oxygen's a principle. And even then, it's a lot of these debates in Germany at the time, and of course throughout the whole of Europe, were about the nature of fire. The nature of activity, of course, they were positing stuff like caloric or ether or phlogiston or warm stuff, literally warm stuff, heat matter. And I think this is really something that Heraclitus is still
very sort of useful for, particularly thinking about Nietzsche, because at the time they were all thinking about what is the nature of pure chemical activity, and even nature of chemistry as a science. Because I mean, back in those days, the early 1800s, particularly, it was no more as an art than a science. It really took the works of people like Goethe and Shelley, and of course, its helpfulness for various kinds of industrial production to really get this thing kicking off again. But the central question, really, for a lot of these physicists was, what the fuck is fire?
I want to circle back to the concept of rationality versus irrationality. This is one thing that really stood out to me in the reading, and maybe a way to increase the stakes for everybody listening is just to pose the question: to what extent should we follow the sort of ethical prescription by Heraclitus to be rational in the sense of pursuing logos? And I also, at this time, want to bring up one of the probably most notable commentators on Heraclitus in the late 20th century up until maybe 10 years ago, which is archetypal psychologist James Hillman. He actually has quite a bit to say about Heraclitus. And this is also a way to sort of bring in the concept of soul and logos, and also to parse some of the distinctions that Heraclitus himself makes with regard to the composition of the universe, which is that, okay, all is fire, yet there's these mentions of water in the fragments. And I'll read a few that I'd like to bring into the discussion. So the first fragment is, a dry soul is wisest and best, right? And so there's this distinction between dryness and moistness, where dry is going to be the thing that we valorize. We don't know what that means yet, but hopefully we'll find out along the way. Another fragment is, for souls, it is death to become water, for death to become earth. But from earth, water is born, and from water, soul. And I don't have this fragment up here, but there's another fragment where Heraclitus also says that the soul's, there's a kind of enjoyment in the soul's death. And now the way that there's a way of reading this in which we can simply say that Heraclitus believed that virtue resides in the soul remaining dry. And this means that the virtue soul pursues knowledge of logos and embraces a kind of fiery rationality that brings awareness to the true nature of reality, in contrast to the moist soul, which is muddled, lost, given over to murky ambiguities. Maybe there's a little bit of drunkenness, ecstasy, some dissolution. And for Heraclitus, the figure of Dionysus is synonymous with the figure of Hades, which I think is an interesting constellation to make, because it puts ecstasy and drunkenness somewhat on the side of death. And Adam and I were talking about this beforehand, like, is Heraclitus kind of an anti-Dionysian? But in comes James Hillman, and I'm just going to read something that James Hillman wrote. Now, for Hillman, the concept of soul is absolutely synonymous with the concept of psyche, at least in the way that we understand psychology, the kind of production of images and imagination, and the way that we relate to our world through these images. Hillman writes, if we connect Heraclitus' statement about water and death with a familiar archetypal motto, a familiar alchemical motto, perform no operation until all has become water, then the opus begins in dying. So I'll just stop there a second, because Heraclitus urges us to make our souls drier, to bring things into the light of consciousness, to embrace this side of the soul that's more associated with fire. And maybe it's important at this time, just going back to one of the fragments that I mentioned, within this larger concept of logos, there are these elemental distinctions where fire becomes water, water becomes air, water becomes earth, and then earth becomes air, and then air becomes fire. And it kind of creates the circle where at each one of these elemental thresholds, a kind of transformation takes place. And what I see James Hillman doing in the following is showing how that perhaps this transformation from fire to water, albeit irrational on Heraclitus's terms, has something for us psychologically. Hillman then continues, when a dream image is moistened, it is entering the dissolutio and is becoming, in Bachelard sense, more psychicized, made into soul. For water is the special element of reverie, the element of reflective images and their ceaseless, ungraspable flow. Moistening in dreams refers to the soul's delight in its death, its delight in sinking away from fixations and literalized concerns. Now, it's important here to understand the one thing that distinguishes Hillman from Heraclitus is that Hillman believes that things like psychological complexes, tension, things that we're kind of chewing on psychologically, firmly reside within the domain of the dry ego soul. And Hillman, he valorizes this descent into water because it's in Hades. It's passing through that Dionysian liminal layer that we can access things like dreams and reveries. And if we kind of work on those things, like in the manner of Carl Jung, and I know, Keegan, you're familiar with Jung's work, that there is a kind of alchemical gold in there. But just looking at the fragments just on their surface, I see Heraclitus as being somewhat angled against that. And I think this might be a good way to sort of structure a little conversation about what is the role of irrationality and rationality in Heraclitus thought. And Keegan, I'll give it to you first, and anyone else can answer after that.
Sure. So what I was thinking of when you were reading Hillman's analysis there was actually the Chinese yin and yang idea. And that's also a huge part of alchemy. Because it involves correspondence, right? The central alchemical idea was as above, so below, and they perceive sort of a correspondence between material transformations and spiritual. And just the interesting thing about that is that we find that cross-culturally, and oftentimes it's the same associations. So it's sort of like a big win for the Jungians, right? If you're trying to promote the idea of these like archetypal enduring truths that are in the collective unconscious of all mankind. I mean, one of the passages in Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks, when Nietzsche is speaking about Parmenides, he talks about how sort of like Wittgenstein 1 and Wittgenstein 2, there's Parmenides 1 and Parmenides 2. So early Parmenides is very different from the Parmenides of pure being. He initially comes up with a sort of categorization scheme for discussing non-being, and he basically says that, well, non-being, well, what is it? It's sort of, it's decline, it's dying, it's moistness, it's darkness, right? I mean, this is like a really common sort of like insight. A lot of theists use this in the problem of evil, but like darkness is just the absence of light, evil is just the absence of good. That's sort of the lines along which Parmenides 1 is thinking, that many of these things which we classify as phenomena are the absence of some positive or active force. But just in looking, aside from the philosophical significance of that and how his thought develops and how he comes to reject those ideas, it's very interesting that the list of things that Parmenides 1 gives is sort of like fire, masculine, active, hot, dry. That's yang in Chinese. It's all of the same associations. And then even like earthy, moist, lowering, what does Lao Tzu say? That the way of water is to seek for the lowest level, which human beings abhor, which I think relates to what we're talking about here. So that's interesting. I think what's going on in Heraclitus, when he says the soul is moist, for example, or like a moist soul is close to death, I think he is quite probably playing upon or utilizing those correspondences which existed within sort of the lexicon of Greek culture in order to, make probably a point similar to what Nietzsche might make about alcohol and what it does to the state of your soul, right? Or about Dionysian revelry. And I don't know if he's actually anti-Dionysian. This sort of circles back to the problem that I brought up at the beginning, that there are so many interpretations. I mean, Saint Clement of Alexandria famously interpreted Heraclitus as like a proto-Christian thinker, because he's saying, oh, when Heraclitus is saying Dionysus and Hades are the same, he's warning you that you're actually worshiping the devil. And when he says that the Dionysian revelers, when they die, will actually see something that they didn't expect, it's because they're going to hell. And the world will end in fire. He means that as like a sort of fiery judgment day. And Nietzsche reads Heraclitus in a totally opposite way from that. He would think that that's totally wrong. But I think a lot of what Heraclitus does is playing with those cultural connotations. I mean, the best example of this is the fragment where he says, the name of the bow, like the bow and arrow, is life, but its work is death. And that's a pun that doesn't translate into English because it's bios is the name for bow, but also that's the root word of biology, like a living thing. So the bow is this thing that's invented for the purpose of killing at a distance, and yet we've given it a name that is similar or a cognate to the word that we use for a living thing. And so in a way, that would be I guess my reading of a lot of this is that Heraclitus is just addressing himself to the cultural context that he's in. Now, does that mean that there is some sort of like archetypal correspondence between, say, clarity of consciousness and fire, something of that nature? I mean, we even find this in in Indian Buddhism, the mind like fire unbound. So there might be something to that from a Jungian angle.
I think there's something to it from a Greek angle too, just in terms of Greek conceptions.
Yeah, I'm agnostic about it. Is just what I mean.
Heraclitus precedes Hippocrates, right? But I think would still be drawing from similar kind of cultural understandings of the mind, and certainly in the Hippocratic model of the mind and explanations of madness, liquids play a predominant role in inducing madness, the inflammation, like a kind of early theory of humors, right? The inflammation of the phren or phrenes, which is the root of phronesis. But the context to me that jumps out, I mean, in this respect, again, I think for what Craig was saying is, I don't know much about Hillman, and I think it's right to place particular emphasis on the psyche, but we have to kind of recognize that the Greek model of the mind is a multiplicity, and the psyche is one of a collection of different terms for mind that also don't really distinguish cleanly between what's going on in the head and what's going on in the heart or the guts, right? So I think the book that I would recommend for anybody who's interested in how these like kind of concepts of the mind in the ancient Greek context work is Ruth Padell's In and Out of the Mind, which is a kind of discussion of how basically the language of the mind in Greek tragedy. And you have this kind of idea of a fragile assemblage, kind of fragile multiplicity that's organized only tenuously, that coordinates not just psyche, but nous and thumos and phren and cardia, and all of this entire collection of kind of inner organs, right? And I think this image of water and the image of I think in a lot of pre-Socratic thought, Craig, what you were getting at, I think in someone like Anaximander is a pretty straightforward attempt to make sense of like the phases of matter, right? And you can see, I think, the way in which Heraclitus is taking this in a different direction, more comprehensive direction, by saying like, no, it's silly to argue whether reality really is a liquid, solid, or gas, right? Rather than seeing these as three different phases of one kind of fundamental thing. And that fundamental thing is probably fire. But I suspect that Heraclitus is availing himself of many of these kinds of like cultural concepts at the time that I think will eventually get expressed more formally in Hippocratic medicine.
I mean, but also in Plato, right? Like Plato's entire doctrine is like what is it that the contemporary Jacques Rancière is like the entirety of the Platonic political disposition is anti-maritime. It's all about the danger and
to the Piraeus at the beginning of the Republic, right?
Yeah, and I just want to say one thing about the use of bion in that fragment on the bow, because there's also the fragment on sleep, right, where the waking life. So bios is kind of the life you can make an account of, right? The life that you can get, it's more, I would say it's closer to biography, your biographical life, than it is to your biological life. So this bow, which becomes your life, your waking life, is always tended towards sleep. And what do you see in sleep? You only see death. So this understanding of and this setting aside of Heraclitus by Alexander Clement is so fascinating to me, right? Because Clement is terrified of the Epicureans, of the Cynics, of most of the materialists and the Stoics, but setting aside Heraclitus in this way that sort of gives an opening to Platonic and then Aristotelian metaphysics, I think is is really interesting, but also the fact that I want to go back to the Nietzschean sort of Heraclitus versus Plato thing. What is Socrates always saying that he tried to do in the Apology? He pestered people to do what? To take care of and understand their life, to give an account of their bios to him, and they never could. And in this sense, Heraclitus is kind of like, well, yeah, duh, like your question begging at the center problematic, which is inexhaustible, and not understandable. And this then circles back to maybe something that Nietzsche and Heidegger share, who are both very disparate thinkers on Heraclitus. Heidegger says in his 41 seminar, he talks about, for Heraclitus, knows of the absent presence of the logos for the human, which is that inexhaustible, formative. It's the logos is sometimes translated as principle for Heraclitus, like Waterfield translates it as principle, which I think is fascinating, not rather than arche being translated as principle. So like this principality, that this life that we always have to give an account of, Heraclitus has already shown the impossibility of that. So in that way, he's shown the perilousness of trying to organize this chaos, when in reality, all you can do is dig for it, which I just think is a really fascinating trend. And in that way, Heraclitus is sort of the negative mirror to what we'd later call the history of philosophy, or the history of subjectivity, or what have you.
Well, we're almost at the 90-minute mark. And to save myself from hours of audio editing, which I'll release on the podcast feed afterwards, maybe we'll move towards finishing up. At this point, Keegan, is there anything else that you wanted to say? Any final comments on Heraclitus, or maybe something that you want to direct us towards in terms of your work, your book, or anything you want to plug?
As far as what I would direct people towards, I would say Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks and Nietzsche's lectures on the pre-Platonics are two of the most important things that Nietzsche wrote that are not usually listed among the published canon, that will greatly expand your appreciation of Nietzsche and the way that he's in dialogue with these thinkers. Something we didn't even mention, but for example, or somebody, Devin mentioned, like Anaximander and Nietzsche's treatment of him. I mean, there's a whole section in Deleuze, Nietzsche, and Philosophy where he talks about how Nietzsche opposes Anaximander to Heraclitus, and that this is very similar to the relationship between Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. Nietzsche overcomes Schopenhauer in a similar way. Yeah. So you'll see all sorts of the beginnings of a lot of Nietzsche's later ideas in these works. So I would highly recommend that, both of those sources. I've done videos on the Philosophy of the Tragic Age of the Greeks, that if you're interested in that, you could check it out. Other than that, I think we covered quite a bit.
Maybe you could say a couple things about what's coming next season on the Nietzsche podcast. What books you're covering?
Oh yeah, we're going to talk about the three tragedians of Athens. We're going to talk about a lot more fiction and just work that's sort of outside. I feel like I've done the due diligence of really trying to exhaustively cover most of the major ideas in Nietzsche and his direct influences, and so we're getting a little bit more loose and free form. So we're going to talk about Klosowski, The Vicious Circle, Dialectic of Enlightenment, some of the sources that you guys have talked about as well. Mishima, Sun and Steel, Heidegger for the first time. We'll be getting into that on the podcast. Very apprehensive about that, and a couple other like little fun forays. I plan to talk about Donna Tartt's Secret History, Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, just some like weird fiction and stuff like that I think ties in and relates to Nietzsche's ideas, particularly his ideas on the Greeks.
And we can't close it out without talking about Devin's Moral Minority podcast. What can we expect over the next couple weeks and months?
Thank you, Craig. It's been a bit slow going lately, but we're going to finish up our series on dialectic enlightenment with our third episode, focused on the culture industry chapter this coming Monday. Should be out sometime Monday evening, probably a bit late. But then we're going to change gears and start doing a few episodes on existentialism, starting with Kierkegaard, mostly focused on fear and trembling. But I think we'll bring in some either or, and we're going to proceed through some Sartre and de Beauvoir as well, and then. Yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead because we're sort of like allowing the narrative to develop as we go. I want to make sure that we're tying things together. But we're going to continue to explore some of the other 20th century attempts to make sense of what kind of normative language we can hold on to amidst a kind of politics and culture of alienation and the ravages of capitalism and so forth. But I appreciate it. If you're interested in discussions of moral philosophy and are kind of anxious about moral elements and moral disagreement of politics today, then check us out. The pod is called Moral Minority, and we're available anywhere you can get your podcasts.
And lastly, please subscribe to Acid Horizon Podcast on Patreon. Just become a supporter for $1. It's Friday. Throw a buck in there right now for the rest of the year. That's less than $10. You can join us. We have reading groups. And hey, if you can't do the $1, you just don't want to, you want to be, kind of anarchist about it, just DM me. I'll throw you in there. But we need the support. We love the support. So please subscribe to our channel on Patreon. I want to thank everyone who's been here today. Keegan, Devin, Will, Adam, and everyone who's listened. Today we were on Twitch, YouTube, and Instagram, and hopefully we'll get to do this a bit more. Let's say goodbye for now. Take care, everyone.